over.
So Lindsay, oh, no, it's okay. Carry on.
Hello, I'm here.
Okay. Hi guys. So this is the hello. We can hear you. This is the 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock panel with Owen Mullen, Jim Odie, and Jonathan Whitelaw. And this is a dark and deadly thrillers. So we have Owen Mullen is a highly regarded crime author who splits his time between Scotland and the Isle of Crete. In his earlier life, he lived in London and worked as a musician and session singer. He's now written 7 books, and his first gangland thriller, Family, was published in 2021. He's also wrote the P.I. Vincent Delaney, the P.I. Charlie Cameron series, Mackenzie Darrick, The Glass Family, which the next one, Insider, will release later on this year, and the Ralph Buchanan Out of the Silence. Then we have Jim. He spent 10 years writing music reviews and interviewing bands for a rock music website. He also contributed lifestyle and comedic features and poems to a number of websites. He writes psychological thrillers, young adult, and horror that often end with his trademark twists. He doesn't believe in being restrained by genres and looks to blur the lines between them. He has 13 book novels and well over a dozen short stories published and republished by different different publishers. That's probably is. And we've got Jonathan Whitelaw, who is an author, journalist, and broadcaster. After working on the front line of Scottish politics, he moved into journalism. Subjects he's covered have varied from breaking news, the arts, culture, and sports, to fashion, music, and even radioactive waste, with everything in between. He's also a regular reviewer and talking head on shows for the BBC and STV. And his first novel, Morbid Relations, came out in 2015 and is a black comedy about family life. Hellcorp was released in 2018 and sees the devil long for a holiday, but is first challenged by God to solve the murder of a man who took 40 years to die. And his third novel, The Man in the Dark, is a sequel to Hellcorp from September 2019. So welcome, guys. So Owen's just dropped out, but obviously he must be in Crete and the signal. I mean, I know yesterday I had a signal problem as well, but what I'll do is I'll just stay around and wait for him to come. But I'll let you guys just talk start, and when obviously Owen comes in, you know.
Certainly, no problem at all. Hopefully he'll be back soon.
We just have to wing it.
Exactly. It's just a double act, Jim. It's just you and I, unfortunately. Yeah. I apologise in advance. At least if we had Owen, it would maybe, kind of dilute some of my awful presence. But here we go. That's great, Lindsay. Thank you very much. Obviously, I was all prepped to be doing everybody's intro and stuff like that. And that's just one less thing that I've had to do. Wonderful, excellent. A nice, easy Saturday night for me.
You have to do some
well, I don't know about you, Jim. I don't know about you, but I've got a whole load of questions for both you, Owen, when he comes back in, and myself. And the first one I was going to ask was, we're talking about dark thrillers, talking about kind of dark crime capers and stuff like that. What is it that attracts you as a writer to that type of genre?
I think it's just delving into things that you're not used to. So the kind of common life and the dark aspects of that is kind of quite intriguing. So anything that's slightly different is always good to delve into and really expand on that. And obviously people are all different, and people's minds can get quite dark, so it's good to kind of play along with that.
Definitely.
So, no, excellent.
Owen, good to have you back.
Finally managed to get here. Thank you.
Excellent. They fed the gerbil that's going round the wheel that powers the internet. I've stocked mine up before we came on. The first question that we've got tonight, or I asked, was we're talking about dark thrillers and things. What is it that attracts you to that particular genre? For you to be for that to be your kind of choice of place to write.
Okay. When I don't read so much these days as I used to because I'm too busy. But at one time I read a lot. And even then, and certainly now, when I read, it's crime fiction that I read. When I watch entertainment films or whatever, I think my favourite film was probably Heat with
Michael Mann, Al Pacino, Robert De Niro.
Michael Mann. It's fantastic. It's a fantastic movie for a writer because every scene in that movie takes the story forward. So the answer to your question, Jonathan, is that I'm really attracted to write what I would read. It's not a big leap for me to do that. The ambition, of course, is to write a book that you would want to read yourself, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So that kind of decides the genre right there.
Good answer. Yeah, I think that's yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think I'm exactly the same. I think I'm exactly the same for both of you. Actually, I think when you sit down to the writing process, when you've got that kind of blank, when you've got that blank page, and you've got characters and plot and settings and stuff like that you're going to have to come up to, you as a writer, I think, have got to be invested in it, because that comes across in the writing if that's not the case. And ultimately, I suppose that's exactly as you say, Owen. It's if you're not invested in the story from the off, if it's not essentially something that you would want to read yourself, if you picked it up off the shelf from another writer, then you're a bit on a kind of hiding to nothing, really. And there's been plenty of times. I mean, that's the thing. Like, I think there's a very, very common misconception. Maybe, well, I say it's a common misconception. Maybe you guys can put me straight. But there's a common misconception, I think, of that readers in particular, or just in general, folk towards writing, think that this type of stuff comes really, really easy to us. And in actual fact, it doesn't. Again, I'm more than happy to be corrected by you two, but it certainly doesn't come all that easy to me. And having something like a backbone of this is a story that I'd want to read. I think that kind of gets you through the tough times, the dark times, when you are kind of struggling as to where you're gonna take it next. Please do say that. I'd love it if you both said no. It's great. It comes to me really, really easily, because I tend to find that I've got that imposter syndrome where I think, God, why me? Why am I the one that can't come up with something clever?
Well, I spent about 5 hours writing today, and I probably got 7,500 words. And I actually stopped, came back to it around 5 o'clock. And I wrote about 250 of them in an hour. So at that time of the day, the scene I was in. But in answer to what you're saying, Jonathan, no, it isn't easy. Yeah. See, there's a difference for me. I know how to write books. I know when I started, I didn't. I had no idea. The idea of writing a book that starts on page 1 and ends 100,000 words later or something was a very, very daunting idea indeed. Yeah. I thought it'd be a lot of padding out, as it is, the last couple of books I've written, I've been kind of struggling to get the story into 100,000 words, because there's quite a lot of story in my stuff. But I make a lot of problems for myself. I get myself a lot of problems on the way. I write something, I don't like it. I have a day where I just can't get into the groove. Yeah. It just isn't there. And I remember an interview with Joni Mitchell, who I'm a great admirer of, who still was a long time ago. I mean, Joni's a true artist, which means you don't have to like all her stuff, but some of her stuff is brilliant. And she said, people think you turn on a faucet, Americanism, and out it comes. That isn't true. Some days the muse isn't there. Yeah. And it's a bit like when people are reading a book, they always assume that someone contacted me last night to say, I didn't know about the ending, so I wasn't so sure. And then they told me they hadn't had much time to read it, so they'd read it on and off over about 5 weeks. Now, if I watched a movie on and off over 5 weeks, what would be my impression of that film? Yep. I wouldn't be very coherent. I wouldn't be very invested, to use your word. So I think the reading and the writing works best when it's in a flow, when it's a kind of compressed time scale. And that's something that personally I can't demand. I can't make that happen. Sometimes a scene just strikes me. I know how it starts. I know how it ends. And it's great fun putting it together, finding all the nice phrases. Otherwise, on another day, I don't like it at all. They're all hack. I've seen it before. I'm bored with what I do, what I write. So no, it's far from easy.
But
Jim, are you the same? You're a last bastion. You're a last bastion for someone to go, do you know what? It's dead easy. I'm like natural talent. That's what we need.
No, I mean, I can jump in and I can write from A to Z nicely like that, but I overlap and I'm adding and I'm constantly changing. So my books always have a twist at the end. And what I find is that the twist doesn't actually come to me until well over 3/4 of the way into the book.
Okay.
And I have lots of subplots, and the subplots come as I'm writing, but that means I have to keep going back and adding things, making things tie up. So actually I can write from the beginning to the end relatively quickly, but then I have to keep going back. And so it's a constant, it's a bit like, I guess, if you had a little room and you were writing, you were doing some sort of mural all over the walls, you do an outline quite quickly all the way around, but then you're going back to it and you're almost doing the detail just by dots over and over and over and over again. And, for me, and I don't know where it's the same for you guys, if I plan my stories out, I get completely bored with them, with the idea of it, because it has to remain exciting and fresh and, just be there right on the top. If not, and that's why I write so quickly as well, because I'm constantly thinking of the next book as well. As I'm getting near the end of my book, I'm thinking of the next one. And that's just how I am. I tried to plan once and it just didn't work at all, because my mind doesn't work like that. But you're right. It is all about, you have to write what you enjoy and the type of book you want to read. And some of the easiest books that I've written have been the two that I've enjoyed the most. They haven't been the most successful at all, but they've been the ones that I've really enjoyed. And, the reviews have been, it's a fun book. And that's what I've enjoyed writing and people have enjoyed reading. But it's not the deepest books that I've written. It hasn't got the most complex, storylines at all, or plots or anything like that. But, I think you have to mix it up a little bit and keep it fresh and really enjoy what you're doing. But it's, I've heard this from other authors as well. You can, you can reread what you've written and you can think, oh my God, what is that? That's it. I've had enough. That's not, it's not what I expected it to be at all. The next day you can read it again and go, actually, I quite like it. And then at the end of the day, you can read it again and go, oh, you know what? I'm really not sure. And it can be a real up and down road of, a roller coaster ride with your emotions, because I guess sometimes it can be such a lonely journey of where you feel like you're on your own. And, you can have all the authors, all the other people giving you support around you, but ultimately your book is there that has you out in the open all on your own, waiting to be knocked down by everyone and, everything. And, we can say that we don't read all our reviews and we don't take it to heart, but let's face it, you have 10 great reviews and then you have one bad one. It's the bad one that you're thinking about.
Yep, of course.
But I think a lot of that is probably because we have to be connected emotionally, because we have to understand people in order to write about them and have that, like I say, that kind of understanding. So we are more open and kind of more sensitive, I guess, to things like that.
Do you guys think that the kind of the obviously the title of this panel is Dark and Deadly Thrillers? Do you guys think that in particular, that that style of crime writing, or that particular genre of crime writing, do you think that kind of lends itself a little bit more from the writing process for kind of having these ups and downs? I mean, I know, I don't want to turn this into a kind of tribalism thing, because that's the thing. Like, away from my Hellcorp books, I write cozy crime, and it's not far from it. I wouldn't say that writing my cozy novels is easier than writing Hellcorp books. It's not the opposite, but they're such completely different beasts, and that's one thing that I've found writing two different types of crime fiction, is that actually, it's not a case of one particular style and one particular subgenre or subset of the genre is easier to do, or in fact is harder to do than any other one. But I think in particular, I think with the kind of, like I said, the title of the panel is Dark and Deadly Thrillers. There is an expectation, I think, from the audience, from readers, with these types of books. And Jim, you touched on it at the start, talking about the kind of that darker nature of human nature, the darker side of human nature that sort of lends itself much more to that than, say, for example, cozy or something more towards romance or indeed like historical crime fiction and things. Is that does it almost kind of create more of the process? Is more of the process having that harder element to it? I mean, Jim, maybe I'll come to you first with this one.
Yeah.
If you're talking about kind of particularly very, very complex plots,
I think we're by nature fascinated by darker side of things.
Yeah.
And the nature of the genre is to try and push boundaries, almost see how much you can get away with, being on the cusp of commercial, but wanting to be, unique and something a little bit different. And that in itself adds pressures to try and be different and do something different and go where other people haven't gone. So, I think things like that do add a difference to it. Whereas another genre that is maybe a little bit more, you can almost play by numbers because people are expecting a lot of things that all you have to do is tick some boxes to a certain degree. Obviously, not to belittle any genre at all, but that, there's an expectation there and people love that and just fall in love with it and will go with it. Whereas sometimes I think with the darker things, people are wanting you to uncover something they've not experienced before and not delved into, not seen, not experienced, and they want to be taken on a journey they've never been on. So sometimes to try and come up with something like that, there is that extra expectation and leads you to then almost be digging around on the internet and to things to come up with some inspirational thing that can push you to where you want to go.
Absolutely. And that's that's something that I've noticed in writing between those two different genres, particularly moving to something like cozy that traditionally would not maybe have quite as much of the gore and not quite as much as that kind of darker element of humanity. That's something like a more contemporary thriller would have. I mean, obviously, it presents completely its own set of challenges, and actually, I think at times I found it a lot harder to write cozy crime. Now, that's probably a commentary on my ability or my inability as a writer. But
would you find that that's more character based, that you have to then really bring more out in the characters? And
I think so. I think so. I think I find myself a lot more aware of what path you're leading your characters down with my cozy mysteries, because it's not that there's a lack of investment. It's not that you're not invested in the character more in a cozy crime than you would be in a thriller, because readers should always be invested in their characters and writers should always be making their characters investable. I just think that from my perspective, I always think that I'm thinking 2, 3, 4, 5 steps further ahead than I would ordinarily with my Hellcorp novels in particular, because almost I find it a little bit harder to write out of a stickier situation that I might have regressed into doing something that doesn't really suit the genre, because I started doing my kind of Hellcorp books first before I did my Parker Sisters series. I think my kind of almost my default setting would be to go back and have someone's head chopped off, for example. That's as awful as that sounds, but that's what happens when you're a crime writer. You can't just end up having someone's head chopped off in a cozy novel in the same sense that you would have it in like a dark thriller. Owen, what do you think of this? I mean, is that something that you're aware of with in your own writing and your own process, and indeed from when you first started to where you are now? Is it changed at all? Is it the same? Is it harder? Is it easier?
It has changed quite a bit, actually. The first agent I had, she told me, she spoke like the Queen. She told me, I won't do the accent, but she told me,
go on, give us a blast.
You're not gritty enough, Owen. You're not edgy enough. Now, if she'd read my last book, which I happen to have here, by the way, it's just as luck
nice, lovely plug.
If she'd read that book, she wouldn't think I wasn't gritty enough. I think the difference between writing, some writers, and probably everyone's done it sometime, so many serial killers, although serial killers in reality are pretty uncommon. They're reckoned to be many that we don't know about. They're reckoned to be pretty uncommon, or they're very, very common in crime fiction literature. And the reason for that is a serial killer is going, by definition, is going to kill a lot of people. Killing a lot of people is a whole lot of tension, which is the essence of drama. So if you're writing a harder, shall we say, a grittier, whatever, I don't like these expressions much. If you're writing that rather than something softer, there is more opportunity to have these high points. I think the readers would think them as high points. It's more easy to resolve something in a bloody mess than it is to perhaps have characters think their way out of them. In the book that's coming out in October, the fourth Charlie Cameron book, there are 2 stories in that book, and one of them is about a gangster, Sean Rafferty, and it's a really, it's a pretty raw story. The other one isn't. The other one is a straightforward, hopefully clever whodunit. Now, there are a couple of violent scenes in the whodunit, but they're not violently portrayed. And if the book was only that, I don't think it would satisfy a great great many of the readers. I think the modern readership are looking for a lot of thrills. Does that make it easier to write? Well, nasty people are easier to write, aren't they? I try to do 2 things. Again, in that book, I try to have a lot of pace and a lot of action, but I also want to develop the characters. One of the characters, for example, Danny Glass, is hopefully a very, very well-rounded character. And even though he's a despicable man, he's interesting to us, which makes for a good read. So I do think that writing darker, and again, for myself, there's a limit to that. I put a self-limit on that. I don't want to write about child abuse. I don't want to write about overly write about domestic violence or incest or any of these cringeable crimes. I don't really want to have that in my head. I don't want to read it. Back to writing what you read. I don't want to read that. So I tend to, and also don't want my characters who, on page 3, was the village postman having a chat as he goes on his round, suddenly becomes a psychotic killer after he kills the first person, then he knows no bounds, so that all these ordinary people somehow unleash some terrible demon inside them, because that just doesn't seem to be, I do believe that everybody is capable of anything, but that just doesn't seem realistic to me. But it is a good vehicle for getting plenty of action on the page. So I think it's a balance for me. It's a balance between telling the story the way it ought to be told, the genre, and where you're cited in that genre tends to dictate that for me. My current books that I'm writing are gangland. So these are pretty nasty people. They live on the edge. They stop at nothing. They're ruthless. They're clever. They're a whole lot of things. They're in it for the right reasons. I think they're in it for money, power, sex, not because someone made a pass at their husband at a wedding 20 years ago. So they're good, honest, really bad criminals, and they do really honest, really, really bad things. So that all adds up. And it was actually not so terribly difficult to write that. What is more difficult is to try to find the overall framework where that kind of thing sits comfortably and believably, rather than just, blood running down the walls every 4th page. That's not good to me.
But they are the characters in your book, because I read it a couple of weeks ago. There is an honesty to them and a softer side that you see, so that they are, like you say, well-rounded. So you do have your typical gangland, the gangsters that are doing these despicable things, but also you see them in their everyday life, and you see that there are the other things in life that they have to deal with along, with the actual plot that's going on. And that's what I enjoyed about it. It didn't feel like a typical gangland, because it did feel like a nice, we don't like to use gritty and stuff like that that much, but it was just something that wasn't the typical. So it did break the boundaries. For me, I thought it was something that was a little bit different, and because too many people, you know, as I know you've said before, you know, think gangland, they think the craze, and they're expecting that, the exact storyline, and they just want to go down that path. But I thought that the way that, you know, you had the two almost rival families that were kind of, you know, but then you had how they're connecting and the overlapping, and, you know, I thought that was really well done. So, you know, well done for
Thanks,
that.
Jim.
We've got a question from Joe Singleton in the chat. Obviously, anybody that wants to send in a question, by all means, get them in. You don't necessarily want to, Jim and Owen don't want to be given the third degree by me all evening. Joe asked, do you all try to have positive male and female characters in your crime books? Jim, you go first. Oh, you've just taken a swig, sorry.
That's all right. I wouldn't say that I deliberately would set out to do anything like that. I don't specifically look at my characters and think I want to have this type of person. I want to have, you know, a person that's maybe a role model or whatever. Because I start out with the idea of a plot and then everything kind of moves from that. So I would say, no, I don't set out to do that. Often my main character will have a lot of goodness at heart. So they may, you know, end up in some dire situations, and they might end up, you know, crossing the path between good and bad. But ultimately, deep down, they have morals, and they do try and, you know, do the right thing, I guess, unless do decide to deliberately. Sometimes, you know, in some of my books, I've thought, right, the main character, what could they do which is good? Right, I'm going to do the opposite. So I try and do the opposite of each time to kind of go against the grain on that, to give them a completely different, you know, and deliberately make them a character that is something a little bit different. But yeah, no, as for, you know, deliberately doing anything, I wouldn't say I, you know, necessarily do. I mean, my new book, The Crazy Season, it's got, so it's a guy who, I say it's a cross between kind of Jonathan Creek and X-Files, because he's an investigative journalist, but he looks into stories that are a little bit like the unexplained, things that people are, you know, have huge claims against, and he basically finds that they're hoaxes. That's what he ends up doing. Now his wife's there was a car crash, and his wife's in a coma for the whole of the book, and so he's torn between trying to get to the bottom of the current story and seeing her all the time, because he sees her daily and, you know, doesn't want to miss a minute. But he's got this sidekick, which is his friend's sister, called Melody, and, you know, what I wanted was her to not necessarily be a sidekick, but to be an equal partner to him. So he's quite almost diluted in this book, because this is book one of a new series, because of he's still getting over, you know, the crash with his wife and what have you. And she's kind of pulling him out of that. And she's doesn't really care, you know, where everyone else is really carefully walking around him and watching what they're saying. And people are almost have left him be because it's a year later. She doesn't care. Not she doesn't care, but she's very brash and just says what she feels, and he actually likes that. So the two of them actually play off each other quite well. And so I was kind of trying to go for, I guess, two people that you didn't have one that was the main one with a sidekick, but I wanted them to both be kind of side by side. So I may actually have just kind of gone back on my original answer there and said that.
That's,
you know,
okay.
what,
that's all right. We forgive you.
Yeah, maybe I did on that one.
Owen, what about you?
What's the question again?
Do you all try to have positive male and female characters in your crime books?
No, I don't. I don't try to. Educate's the wrong word. I don't try to do anything like that. The story kind of what the story is going to be, and I do plan beforehand. I need to know where it's going, or I can't write anything. I need to know where it's going, and where it's going. Then you populate that tale with whoever you do. But there's no other intention other than that the characters have got to fulfill the roles that take the story forward. Now, when you're writing a character, even someone like in my last book, Danny Glass, who's the older brother of the gangster brothers, and he's a terrible, despicable man. But at one point, he likes his music. He likes music from the 1960s. At one point, his jukebox in his office gets wrecked, and his copy of this Kinks Waterloo Sunset gets smashed, and he's down on his knees almost in tears, which shows that even though Danny would have you in a lime pit grave in the New Forest if you say the wrong word to him, there's a little bit of humanity to him because he cares about his records. He cares about because there's got to be a bit of something in everybody. As Jim was saying about getting to know them a bit better. When I was writing Charlie Cameron, it occurred to me, and this was very early on in my writing career. Okay, so Charlie's going to be looking at this case, and he's going to make phone calls, and he's going to go around and knock doors, and he's going to speak to people. And what does he do for the rest of the day? What does he do at night? Who is he? I mean, the idea that that's all that was in his life, man, that would take up 2 or 3 hours perhaps of your day. Who are you the rest of the time?
Yeah.
What do you think about this? Where do you live? What's your girlfriend relationship like? Who are your friends? And before you know, you've built up an alternate universe that this character is in, whatever character, whatever book. So that's how it tends to be for me, not from any, this needs to be a positive male thing. Some of my books have seemed to be, especially the one in Pakistan, Out of the Silence, perhaps to be about a social commentary. I think it probably is a social comment, but by default, really for me, it was an interesting story idea. That's the beginning and that's the end.
Yep, I would agree. Yes, absolutely. I think I don't think that if I'm writing my Hellcorp novels, the main character is the devil, and that's clearly not a good guy. Not a good guy, even though he's the main protagonist and he's all right in the end. But I think one of the great things about having a character like him, or indeed the character of him in the Hellcorp novels, is that he has no filter and he has no qualms and no reason essentially to stand on ceremony, and that means that what you tend to find is, or what I've found as an interesting sort of as an interesting sort of byproduct almost, because it wasn't something that I set out to do. Because I agree, I agree with both you chaps in that the characters that are created for the novel are created for the novel. They're created for the story, to tell the story the best way that they can be. If that means that they're goody two shoes, or it means that they're terrible, or anywhere in between, then so be it. But one of the interesting byproducts that I've found from doing the Hellcorp novels and having a character like the devil as the central protagonist and the one who ultimately kind of solves the crime, is that well, it's really quite liberating to have that freedom, to have that type of character say essentially what they want, good and bad, mostly bad, but good and bad. It means that the characters that you put around him, they have to almost act at times as a conscience. They have to act as the voice of reason. They have to act as the the proper Jiminy Cricket type role at times. And actually, particularly in the first one, he gets teamed up with a human doctor, a human A&E doctor, Jill Gideon, and she very much fulfills all of those roles. Whereas with The Man in the Dark, it's slightly different, because you've got there are more characters. It's the second novel in the series that invariably the cast explodes, and that's something that I hadn't intended to set out to do with the series, with the novels, because and to a certain degree I still don't, because again it's been a nice byproduct that you've ended up with characters who are who end up being a lot better, better in the moral sense, better in the sort of decision sense, because they have to be when you've got a central character that is utterly despicable, and is defined by how despicable he is. I thought that was interesting. I think both of you touched on it. I'm kind of writing the worst characters. That's who everybody wants to read. It's certainly who I want to write. I take take great delight in being able to kind of write really, really nasty buggers. And it's almost therapeutic, because as a writer, you've got that outlet to be able to do something like that. It doesn't get bottled up. You just pour it into the character and let them say what you want, say what you might have wanted to say in particular situations. Just as a very, very brief side note before we carry on. But speaking of which, there's a scene at the end of Hellcorp. It's not a spoiler. It's not a spoiler for anybody that hasn't read it. But there's a scene at the end where the devil is in a church, and a bloke comes in during a service and blows out all the candles at one of the altars. And he sees this and thinks it's utterly outrageous, completely disrespectful, totally, and the idea that you've got someone like Beelzebub being the kind of voice of reason to something like that, and he collars the guy and gives him a right good rollicking, and that actually happened. That was based on something that my wife had experienced when we stayed in Edinburgh. She'd attended a service on a Sunday morning, and someone came in and blew out all the candles in the middle of it. I think he flipped the bird and then walked out, and it stuck with me. And I thought, God, if I'd been there, what would I have done? Would I have done anything? I probably wouldn't have done anything. But putting that into the Hellcorp novel, it meant that, or the first Hellcorp novel, it meant that it was. It meant that I could almost act out what would have been the right thing to do, and having the opportunity to do that. So yeah, in that sense, does that mean that I had kind of deliberately, I tried to set right a wrong that had happened in real life? Does that kind of count for deliberately making the character good or bad? Possibly. I think the conclusion that we can draw from what was a brilliant question is that we're not quite as black and white when it comes to creating our characters as we maybe think that we are, and that there's a chance that there's more to it. Do you guys get that? I mean, both of you. Owen, we'll come to you first this time. Do you guys find that when you're kind of sitting down and you're creating these characters, do you have an idea what this character is going to be like before you start the novel, and then, depending on the kind of set pieces and the scenes and the way that the novel's panning out, do you sometimes find that come the end of it, they're a totally different character to when you first started out? Are they, better or worse? Are they, have you come across a quirk that you hadn't planned would be there in the first place? Is that something that you guys get?
I think in a couple of my books, the character has intentionally been changed by what has gone on. And Out of the Silence, that's true. So it's a book about salvation, and that it's about a lot of things, but salvation in that respect. And even in Family, one of the characters ends up in a position that he didn't intend to be when the book started off. I think the characters. I think when you write, I can only speak for me. Everyone does it differently. I have a vague idea. Then the other factors that mold whoever that would be start to come into play. For example, the location. Location is very important to me. It actually aids the writing fantastically. If it's a balmy, the further away, the better. Faraway places with strange sounding names. So like Pakistan, couple of books I have in New Orleans. I've got quite a few books in Glasgow. Glasgow is a really good place to write for me because I know it pretty well. What most of my life there, I lived in and around it. The same can't be said for where I am tonight in Crete, because people say to me, why don't you write something in Crete? And the answer is, it just doesn't call to me in the same way that London did when I lived there. I mean, someone gave me a bit of advice very early on in my writing journey. They said, the location should really be another character almost. And yeah. I think that's true. And if you've got a location like London, with all these well-known landmarks and well-known names, it's very easy to set the scene and set different scenes in different places and get the flavour of that big metropolis and the underbelly of it at the same time. So yeah, it's the characters change as they go. I think I have a basic outline of whether he's. I mean, we know whether he's one of the good guys or the bad guys. And really, Jonathan, I think it's back to the character changes along with something I learned a long time ago, that the story and the plot are not the same. The story is rich, poor boy becomes rich man. The plot line is how, and then what, and then what. So all the hows and what happens next are all contribute to the character's emotional reaction, all as they do in real life to us. All contribute. I mean, there's a core there. There has to be a core, which is either good or bad. But beyond that, there's a bit of tolerance one way or the other, so that good guys can do bad things, and bad guys can show that they're not all bad.
Yep, absolutely. Jim?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much the same, really. I mean, I guess I clearly do less planning than Owen, and I clearly write off the edge of my seat and wing it a little bit more. But what I find is, I have this very vague idea of what I want some of the main characters to be like, and then obviously the ones which kind of pop up and carry on within the story will then form as and when you go on. But each scene is almost like a choose your own adventure book. I guess you get to a point and you're at a crossroads and you think, right, is my character going to be like this or is it going to be like that? And that slowly molds to then how they'll react within the next scenes and going forward kind of from there. Completely agree with Owen that the location is a huge thing. For me, I'm not a big fan of big cities and things like that because I grew up on a farm in the middle of nowhere, and that's what I know, that's what I enjoy, that's what I like. So films and books and things I will read and I'm drawn to that are in small fishing villages, down by the beach in the country, a house in the woods, that sort of thing, very remote locations where you've got, I guess, less characters and it's a little bit more, you can then be darker and more sinister. Whereas, dark and sinister in a city to me is just me as a country boy going out into the big wide world with a whole load of, millions of people surrounding you. And, that's a whole different kind of concept of, so I don't bring that into my books at all because it's, again, it's not what I know. It's not what I write about. Most of mine are either they're set in a fictitious town called Thornhill, which I have that place not far from where I live now, in Swindon in Wiltshire. But often the stories will lead me out further afar. So that'll be places like a lot Cornwall and Devon, because those are places I know well. So, I would go to those places because, like Owen said, you know all about it. You can set your story there. You kind of know the local things, the local ideas. You can do a bit of more research of legends and stories and understand the history of it a little bit more, which will just gives that credibility to the story and a little bit more. And almost going back to what we were saying about the characters, I feel you don't really ever want to be preaching at all because for one, people will see through that, and I think it's very hard. Then you're kind of setting yourself up for your future books and what have you, and you have to be very careful. And I'm sure both of you have felt this as well. So any strong feelings towards things you want to try and stay away from, because if you talk about religion, you want to kind of be a bit more either vague or very two-sided about it and very open. You don't want to be going in one side or another and saying
Absolutely.
This is this, and you have to be very careful because readers will think that whatever your character thinks is what you think yourself. I had this in a young adult novel that I wrote where the main character was a 17-year-old who'd moved from England to America, and he was having an argument with his teacher over Shakespeare, saying that he didn't think Shakespeare was any good at all. And someone wrote to me and said that they'd actually stopped reading the book because they thought it was awful because Shakespeare was brilliant, and how could I say that? And I said, well, this was a 17-year-old who was having an argument with the teacher. That wasn't me saying that. And as we know, if we're writing dark fiction, invariably what's happening with our characters is not what we'd be doing, else we wouldn't be here, we'd be in a jail cell. So it's a very interesting thing. But my characters will grow as the book goes, and you almost have a list of all the kind of the idea of what they're like by the end of it, where it starts vague and they get very detailed near the end. And this is something I found different from. So when I started out, predominantly it was all standalones, albeit I have some characters which do mingle and go in between, and so it's all kind of in the same world, but different stories. And the main character in one is a friend in another, and all things like that. However, now I've started writing series. Obviously, whereas before you're just starting almost with fresh ideas, and you've got a semblance of having to think about what those characters were like in the other books, but now you have to really start thinking, right, okay, I built them like this, so I've got to continue with that. So like we've said, or like I've said, where they start vague and end up detailed at the end, now they're starting detailed again and remaining that way, but almost adding to that. So you're really becoming more familiar and more familiar as you're going along. So hopefully they're like a friend, from book to book, and you really become engaged with them and want to know their story.
There's a great question from the brilliant writer Marion Todd, who's in here. Good evening, Marion. Thank you for this question. She's asking, and I think it's actually really, really pertinent for this type of genre, and it kind of leads on exactly from what you're saying there, Jim. Would any of you include the current pandemic in future novels, or will you just be glad to forget about it? I think I'll certainly be glad to forget about it. I think everybody will be glad to forget about it. Interesting to get you guys' thoughts, because this is something that's obviously becoming more and more. Certainly, with the fact that we're sitting here now a year on from lockdown, and obviously over a year from the first case globally. It's become the hot topic when it comes to any sort of fiction, really, hasn't it? It's how much do you include in it? How much do you include all the kind of fallout, all the language, all the lingo, all the fact that this has happened? Is this something that you guys have thought about? Owen, I'll come to you first with this one.
Finally, you should mention it. Thanks for that question, Marion. I watched a podcast interview between Michael Connolly and John, who's the guy who writes all the legal things in America?
John Grisham.
John Grisham. And they were talking about this very subject. And Michael Connolly said that for six or 8 weeks, he couldn't write anything for the first time in his writing life because of the uncertainty of where the pandemic was going and what kind of world would be there at the end of it. I can't remember what John Grisham's answer was, but the pandemic doesn't feature in anything I've written, and I won't feature in anything I've written, because Michael Connolly says he is trying to mirror the world. I'm not trying to mirror the real world. For example, Donald Trump's 4 years doesn't appear. Politics doesn't appear in my books. I don't have any serious social comments to make about any of the questions of the age. I think it would have been handy if you'd already written a pandemic book as it came out. That would have been all right. But no, the answer is, for me, I don't have any. It just doesn't feature. It's a bit like the same as why don't I write about Crete, where I'm just now. It just doesn't. It's not in the story. It's not there. If it was there, then I would have to think about it. But no, it's not where I'm.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, actually, just before I come to you, Jim, a very, very quick aside talking about Donald Trump, in Hellcorp, which came out in 2018. There's a line in it that I'd written long before the Trump presidency, right at the start, where the devil says that he wants the eponymous Hellcorp built on top of Arthur's Seat, but he wants it to be all black glass and shiny, just like the Trump Tower in New York. And little did I know at the time that it would end up coming out in the middle of in the middle of the Trump presidency, and the idea that the devil was emulating Mr. Trump. I was clearly ahead of the game. I was clearly ahead of the trend. I was making comment about Trump before it was cool. Jim, sorry, the intermission finished.
Yeah, no, I won't be mentioning it at all. Really, it's not really something that I want to bring into my books. because I think once you start mentioning it, you have to then understand all of the restrictions and all of how it will pull, within your story. You're bringing in this big character that you have to then, integrate with whatever you're trying to do. And, for me, part of it is it feels like a huge restriction then on the books. Another part is it will date them straight away. I try not to put dates in there too much in my books because, straight away the next year it's old hat and whatever. And I don't know. I think it's one of those things that we kind of want to forget about how it's been, and I mean, you don't want to totally forget about it because it's a huge thing that we've been through. And, certainly for my kids, it's something that they'll always remember, and it'll be, the thing that they'll talk to their kids and whatever about in the future. And it is a major thing. But do I want to read about it? Do I want to write about it? And no is the answer on that. I don't know. I haven't heard too much of other people that particularly want to read it. I've seen this in various groups before, and there's been mixed within it. A lot of people have said that they may mention it, whether it's only a slight mention or what have you. But I don't know. It's not something that I want to touch on. I guess I could say I'll never say never, because if I was writing a horror story where it might lead nicely into that, then that might work. But, certainly for just my psychological thrillers, I have no plans whatsoever to bring it in.
I think that's interesting. I think I agree. I do agree. I'm the same. I think it's really kind of trying to strike that balance, isn't it? It's striking that balance as being a writer who, and particularly in this type of writing where there is an escapism element to it. Jim, you said it earlier on. If we were, the reason that we're writing these types of books is that people can sit down and read them. You can read them and not end up in jail because the stuff that's going on is jail worthy. And I think I've certainly spent the majority of the year from a writing perspective thinking about that and going, do I really want to be? If I was a reader, would I want to be sitting and reading about what I've lived through? I suppose it's one of these things. I mean, you're talking about historical fiction, historical crime fiction is a massive market. Now, okay, there's a big difference between writing a novel set in ancient Rome 2,000 years ago to 3,000 years ago to what's happened in the last 12 months. But maybe it's something for future generations of writers. Maybe it's something that they will look back on it and see as this period. Because I mean, ultimately, we're still living through it, aren't we? We don't know where the end point is. We're certainly not at the end point. Could the end point be within the next 12 months? Could it be within the next 12 years? We don't know. Exactly that. And I think the kind of dating element of it, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. It's, it feels a little too soon at the moment for me anyway, for me as a writer. And that's not to say that.
I think that I can see in 5 or 6 years time or, longer that people then might be wanting to revisit that and reset their books and stories within that, with the experiences they've had and stuff like that. But I think you're right. It's all too soon at the moment. We're still living through it. And, ultimately writing and reading is escapism. And you don't want to escape from reality back into reality.
It also is about what Michael Connolly in that interview said. If you're trying to reflect, what happens in your writing is trying to reflect the real world, then this might be a dilemma for you. But if you're creating, in my case, an alternate London or an alternate Glasgow or an alternate wherever, it just doesn't have a place, unless it had a place in the book. Some people have written, famously, The Stand, Stephen King, 30 or 40 years ago, is about the post-apocalyptic events. The Road by Cormac, whatever his name is, McCarthy, is it? Is a similar kind of thing, different from this, but it's the same far-reaching world effect. No, it just doesn't interest me to do that. I would be interested to hear what Marion's idea of it is, though.
Well, I mean that's the thing, is that that's the great thing about writing, though, isn't it? And any genre, in particular with the kind of genre the genre of crime that we all write in, is that there is genuinely room for it. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think there's an element of uncreativity on my part. The first thing that I thought of when that question came up, or when I heard or seen it elsewhere, is that, would I be able to work in 2 meter apart, social distancing element of it, masks and stuff? How would I work that in? And from my point of view, I don't think that, certainly I'm not in the headspace at the moment to be able to work that constantly into a novel and then subsequently deal with the that being another thing that you have to deal with. But then again, that's the great thing about about writing, is that, and it should be the good thing about being a writer, is that you challenge yourself to do these types of things. And I've always tried to pride myself on challenging it. So maybe, as much as I've sat here for the last 5 minutes and said that no, I'm absolutely not touching it, that's what I'm going to go in and do next. Is have a COVID saturated thriller novel where I force myself to have to deal with it. Marion's come back to us, actually. She says she plans to steer clear of it. I had thought I might add a nod in our current novel, but it just won't come. So there we go. I think we're all.
I think the whole process challenging enough, Jonathan.
Exactly. Yeah. Here. I'll drink to that one. Listen, it's different horses for different courses and what have you. Okay. And I think you're absolutely right, Jim. I think within the next 5-10 years, you're going to start seeing a lot more. I think you're probably going to start seeing a lot more of it creep in, whether it's purely just from a setting point of view, whether it plays a much larger role within the nature of plots for crime and all the rest of it. I mean, what the interesting thing is, again, talking about byproducts and stuff like that, I'm a journalist. So one of the interesting elements that we've had has been, if we're doing court stories about criminals who've been convicted, over the last year, they've all had their faces blurred, obscured by masks, and you almost can't identify them. Is that something that, as I always say with at Christmas, how many times do the police get called at Christmas to say that someone in a bright red suit with wearing a fake white mask and a hat has held up a bank or held up a convenience store or something like that? Is that how it's going to make itself known? Is it going to be, we're living in an age where the identity, people's identity, is a lot harder to see and do on a day-to-day basis? I mean, surely that's prime crime fodder, as they say. But I see that Lindsay's here. I think I've rabbited on far too long.
No,
is that time up, Lindsay?
No, you still. Well, I'm going to give you an extra minutes, obviously, because we Owen having the issues getting on in there. I'm just going to say, I agree with what you were saying in the last comment, because I know that May got a hell of a lot of from your reviews and stuff on lockdown. Even though I thought it was a brilliant book, I think people just thought it was far too. He'd written it years before, though. That's what you're saying. He'd written it years before, and then obviously publisher pushed to be released in April that time last year, but he got a hell of a lot of stick for releasing it because it was far too, we were all just going through it, and it was just too much, too similar, and you can see people's points, but then, I mean, obviously you've got Les Kelly as well, writes The Health of Strangers, which she's on tomorrow, and I really want to question again more in depth on that. How is that affected? Because people must be now thinking, I don't read a book that's just too much like now. But I think a question again, somebody, because Caroline is asking, how did you get started in your writing career? Just quickly.
I always wanted to be a writer. I used to write stories for my action figures, my Star Wars and Batman and wrestling figures when I used to go on holiday and not be able to take them. So when I came back from holiday, I used to act out the things that I'd written, and then I carried on when I was in school, obviously, and then in through uni. And it's just something that I always wanted to do. So I know that's a bit of a cop out, but it's just been a calling. I'll use that awfully trite and cliched term. It's always been a calling, darling. Come on, one of you guys must have a better story than that.
I run I won a short story writing competition for schools when I was in primary school. I was 10 years old. And I didn't write anything for decades and decades after that. It just never occurred to me. And only when I come down here and started to stay here, I woke up one morning and I said to my wife, I think I'll write a book. And I'd forgotten about the short story thing. It's only when I went in my memory I remember it. So did I always want to be a writer? No. I always wanted to be a lot of things. I'd have been happier to be Paul McCartney, but that didn't work
out. What about you, Jim?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. I say I grew up living in the middle of nowhere, and very much I used to, watch TV, read. I read books ever since I was little, and I've always had a go at everything that I've enjoyed. So whether it's music, I always try and play any instrument, although I can't very well. I play football because I watched it and I thought I could have a go at that, and so I always wanted to have a go at everything. So yeah, probably age of 6 or 7, I was writing stories that had all your classics of Frankenstein's, Dracula's, werewolves, and all that in big haunted houses that had, your hidden rooms and hidden corridors and booby traps and stuff. And ultimately, my debut novel, Lost Connections, is in a huge house in the middle of nowhere that has hidden rooms and hidden corridors and booby traps and stuff like that. So I guess you kind of progress from there. I tried writing a Rupert the Bear book when I was little as well, and found very quickly the issues with copyright that my mum broke it to me, that I wouldn't be able to do that because it was a trademark and all this. And I was, I thought the story was quite good, quite frankly, but it hit me quite hard as about an 8-year-old that I wouldn't be able to go any further with that story, and I'd have to come up with my own ideas. So I guess I started learning the legalities of literature before anything else.
What an intro to the writing world. Brilliant story, but you can't. It's a copyright infringement. Here's a lawsuit. Brilliant, fantastic.
Stay off school though, probably.
Yeah, I'll bet. Yeah, in front of the Old Bailey. Yeah.
Thank you. So thank you very much, guys. That was so interesting. I just want to plug the next event, which is at 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock, and it's Noel Holden and Jan Bearden, and it's both authors. So that'll be quite interesting.
That'll be smashing.
Point of view. Thank you so much again. It's been a pleasure having you on the panel. And it's interesting to hear all the different stories of how you got started, your inspirations, what makes your mind tick. As you say, some people have got good minds and some people don't, and you've got cozy crime, you've got like thrillers that like every page with a dead body on it, and it's just interesting to see the different style of writing as well. So thank you very much. So I will just end the broadcast.